At 11:52 last night, inside a nondescript boardroom on Bay Street in Toronto, Canada's newly sworn-in Prime Minister Mark Carney picked up a secure phone and made a call that would detonate across global markets before the opening bell. At virtually the same hour, inside the Oval Office, Donald Trump signed an executive order that three sources familiar with the administration's internal deliberations are describing as the most aggressive economic action against a treaty ally in the post-World War II era. What happened in the space between those two phone calls is what every serious investor, every retired American living on a fixed income, and every person who depends on the functioning of the North American economy needs to understand right now. I need you to stop whatever you are doing and listen closely, because the chain reaction that was set in motion in the last 18 hours does not end with a tariff. It ends with a restructuring of the most integrated bilateral trading relationship in human history, and the reverberations are going to reach your grocery bill, your retirement portfolio, and your family's economic security in ways that mainstream financial media is only beginning to comprehend. If you are not subscribed to this channel with notifications turned on, do it right now, because the next 72 hours will deliver developments that will move faster than any single news cycle can track, and I will be here with the breakdown before the spin machine has a chance to bury what actually happened. Here is what we know. According to three sources familiar with the White House's trade policy deliberations, two from the Office of the United States Trade Representative and one from a senior aide on the National Economic Council, the emergency tariff order signed overnight was not a spontaneous escalation. It was the culmination of a 6-week internal campaign by a faction inside the administration that viewed Canada's recent posture on energy pricing and military spending as a direct provocation requiring a response calibrated to cause maximum short-term economic pain. The order, which runs to 47 pages according to one person briefed on the document, imposes a 25% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the United States effective at 6 o'clock a.m. Eastern this morning, with a separate 35% punitive rate applied specifically to Canadian softwood lumber, aluminum and dairy products. These are not the temporary, graduated tariffs that trade lawyers had been modelling. These are emergency measures invoked under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, the same national security provision used against steel and aluminum during Trump's first term. The legal mechanism matters enormously because it allows the administration to bypass the normal 90-day consultation window with Congress. If this analysis is giving you context you cannot find anywhere else right now, hit that like button, because the institutional details are exactly what the cable networks are glossing over this morning. Now let me walk you through exactly how we got here, because the timeline reveals something that the hourly news updates are completely missing. This did not begin yesterday. This was a cascade of decisions, strategic provocations, and calculated miscalculations that unfolded over the past 43 days, and every single step is documented. On January 23rd, the newly inaugurated Trump administration sent a formal diplomatic communication to Ottawa demanding that Canada increase its NATO defense spending contribution to 3% of GDP within 18 months, a demand that exceeded even the most aggressive NATO burden-sharing proposals ever formally tabled, and one that sources inside Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs describe as being received with what one official called stunned disbelief. The Canadian government, then still operating under the final weeks of the Trudeau administration, acknowledged the communication but did not publicly respond, a silence that multiple people briefed on subsequent White House discussions say was interpreted inside the West Wing not as diplomatic caution but as contempt. Then came February 8th, and the moment that, according to three individuals with knowledge of Oval Office discussions, fundamentally changed the emotional temperature of Trump's posture toward Canada. On that date, the Bank of Canada, still operating under Governor Tiff Macklem, announced an emergency rate cut of 50 basis points in response to what Macklem publicly described as the threat of American tariff uncertainty to Canadian economic stability. The White House received that announcement as a declaration of economic warfare, with one senior advisor describing it internally, according to a person familiar with the conversation, as Canada weaponizing its monetary policy to preemptively undercut American leverage. Whether that characterization is accurate or not is almost beside the point. The perception inside the administration hardened, and from that moment forward, the question being asked in internal deliberations was not whether to escalate, but when and how hard. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because what I am about to walk you through next is the piece of this story that every financial publication is treating as back detail, when it is actually the central mechanism driving everything that happened last night. But before we get to Carney, you need to understand what happened on February 22nd, because without that date, nothing that followed makes any sense. On February 22nd, the Canadian government released a comprehensive energy pricing review document, 112 pages, publicly available through Natural Resources Canada, that proposed a new framework for cross-border electricity transmission pricing that would effectively increase the cost of Canadian hydroelectric power exports to Northern American states by an estimated 18 to 23% over a 5-year implementation window. The document was framed as a domestic energy sovereignty measure, the kind of regulatory adjustment that under normal bilateral conditions would have been resolved through the existing joint Commission framework that has governed cross-border energy trade since the 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty. But these are not normal bilateral conditions, and 3 people briefed on the Oval Office's reaction to that document described the response as volcanic. Trump, according to one person with direct knowledge of a senior staff meeting held the morning after the document was released, described it as Canada trying to tax Americans for the right to use their own northern border. That framing, inaccurate in its technical specifics but politically combustible in its emotional logic, became the internal administration narrative that overrode the more measured analysis being offered by career trade officials. By the end of that week, the Section 232 framework was being actively prepared. The formal announcement last night was the end of a process that had already been decided nearly 2 weeks ago. Enter Mark Carney. If you are not familiar with Mark Carney, the man who replaced Justin Trudeau as Canadian Prime Minister in an accelerated Liberal leadership process finalized just 11 days ago, you need to understand who you are actually dealing with, because the Trump administration does not appear to have fully gamed out what a Carney-led Canada means for the leverage calculus they were using when they designed this tariff package. Carney spent 8 years as governor of the Bank of Canada before becoming the only person in modern economic history to serve as governor of 2 G7 central banks simultaneously, leading the Bank of England through the Brexit crisis from 2013 to 2020. He is not a politician who stumbled into economics. He is an economist who deliberately stepped into politics at the precise moment his country faced an existential economic confrontation with its largest trading partner. And what Carney did at midnight last night, the move that according to multiple sources briefed on the Canadian government's internal deliberations was 3 weeks in preparation, was not a reaction. It was a prepared detonation. Carney announced, effective immediate, a retaliatory tariff package imposing a 30% levy on $155 billion in American goods, with the specific targeting designed by his own hand to maximize political pain in American congressional districts whose representatives sit on committees with jurisdiction over trade legislation, agricultural exports from Iowa, Wisconsin, and Michigan, auto parts from Ohio and Indiana, medical devices from Minnesota. The targeting was not random. It was a surgical map drawn by a man who spent a decade studying how central banks use precision instruments to move economies, and he applied that same precision to political pain distribution. If you're watching this and you're not subscribed, what are you waiting for? This channel is showing you the architectural logic that the morning shows are not equipped to explain. Subscribe now. Here is where it gets dangerous, and this is the part that should genuinely concern every American who has a retirement account, a pension, or any exposure to equity markets. At 7:14 this morning, futures markets opened, and the Dow dropped 412 points in the first 9 minutes of pre-market trading. That alone is not the story. The story is what happened to the 2-year Treasury yield at 7:31, when it dropped 6 basis points in 11 minutes on volume that 3 fixed-income analysts who spoke to sources familiar with the overnight positioning described as consistent with a significant institutional flight-to-safety move. Someone, or multiple someones with very large balance sheets, was repositioning before the general market even had time to process the news properly. And simultaneously, at 7:43, the Canadian dollar moved against the US dollar with a volatility measure that currency strategists at two major institutions, both of whom ask not to be identified, described as inconsistent with a market simply pricing in known tariff news. The options positioning in the days preceding the announcement, according to one person briefed on regulatory monitoring data, suggests the market was not entirely surprised. The investigation into that positioning is a separate story, but it is a thread that is not going to stay quiet. Smash that like button if you understand why the market mechanics matter as much as the political narrative here, because the financial dimension of what happened last night has implications for every person watching this who has savings at risk. Now let me tell you something that has not been reported anywhere this morning, and I want you to pay very close attention, because this detail changes the entire interpretation of what you are watching. According to two people briefed on discussions inside Canada's Privy Council office in the 72 hours before the retaliatory announcement, the Carney government made a deliberate decision not to pre-notify Washington of the scale or the targeting precision of its response package. In virtually every prior bilateral trade dispute between the United States and Canada, including the lumber disputes of 2001 and 2017, and the steel and aluminium confrontations of 2018, the Canadian government provided informal advance notice of its retaliatory measures through back-channel diplomatic communication as a face-saving mechanism, a way of giving the American side the option to pull back before the public announcement made withdrawal politically impossible. Carney did not make that call. The decision not to pre-notify, according to one person with direct knowledge of the internal debate, was explicitly framed as a strategic choice to deny the Trump administration the option of a quiet retreat and instead force a fully public confrontation in which both governments would be locked into their stated positions before either side could manage the optics. That is not the decision of a government that is hoping to negotiate. That is the decision of a government that has calculated that public pressure, rather than private diplomacy, is the more favorable terrain, and that calculation, right or wrong, tells you everything you need to know about how long this standoff is going to last. Here is where the story escalates beyond a bilateral trade dispute and becomes something considerably larger. But before I take you there, let me give you the one piece of domestic American political context that explains why the next 72 hours inside Congress may matter as much as anything happening at the diplomatic level. By 10:30 this morning, 3 Republican senators from states with significant agricultural export exposure to Canada, 2 from the upper Midwest, 1 from the Pacific Northwest, had already placed calls to the Senate Finance Committee chairman requesting an emergency briefing on the tariff order's scope and legal basis, according to a person familiar with the committee's scheduling discussions. These are not Democrats looking for an attack line. These are members of the president's own party, whose constituents will begin feeling the retaliatory tariff impact on American agricultural exports within the first billing cycle. The political math here is not complicated. Canada is the United States' largest agricultural export market. Any prolonged Canadian retaliation targeting American farm products creates a constituency problem for Republican senators in states where the farm vote is structurally decisive. The question is whether that constituency pressure reaches a level of intensity sufficient to give the administration political incentive to seek an exit from the confrontation, or whether the nationalist electoral logic that drove the tariff decision in the first place insulates the White House from congressional pressure of this kind. Former trade negotiator Wendy Cutler, who served in senior roles at the Office of the United States Trade Representative across multiple administrations and has spoken publicly about the current situation, has noted that the speed and precision of the Canadian retaliation suggests a level of preparedness that changes the negotiating environment fundamentally compared to prior disputes. That assessment is shared, according to 3 people familiar with private deliberations at major trade-dependent American corporations, by senior executives at some of the largest manufacturers in the country who are now quietly wargaming supply chain restructuring scenarios that would have been considered purely theoretical as recently as 48 hours ago. At 9 o'clock a.m. Eastern this morning, the European Union's trade commissioner, issued a statement from Brussels that used language three diplomatic analysts familiar with transatlantic trade law describe as deliberately calibrated to signal that Europe is preparing to invoke its anti-coercion instrument, a legal mechanism the EU formalized in 2023, specifically designed to allow collective, European retaliation against third-country economic coercion of EU member states or close partners. Canada is not an EU member state, but it is a party to the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the European Union, and three legal scholars who study trade law at Georgetown, Oxford, and the Freie Universität Berlin all reached the same independent conclusion when contacted this morning. The language in the Brussels statement is a public signal that Europe may be preparing to treat an American tariff assault on Canada as a triggering condition for coordinated multilateral pushback. If that interpretation is correct, and the probability, according to two senior trade policy analysts briefed on European internal discussions, sits at approximately 60%, then what the Trump administration launched last night is not a bilateral dispute. It is the opening move of a multilateral economic confrontation involving the United States on one side and the combined trade weight of Canada, the European Union, and potentially the United Kingdom on the other. That coalition represents 44% of global GDP. This is not a tariff fight. This is a realignment. Let me bring this together and show you exactly where this goes from here, because we are at an inflection point, and the next 72 hours will determine which of several trajectories becomes the dominant reality. The first scenario, which I assign a probability of approximately 30%, is rapid de-escalation driven by back-channel negotiations that both governments quietly initiate within the next 48 hours. This is the scenario that markets are pricing as their base case based on historical precedent from the first Trump term, where aggressive tariff announcements were frequently followed by negotiated retreats. The problem with this scenario is that Mark Carney is not Justin Trudeau, and the political incentives driving each leader are structurally different from 2018. Carney has staked his brand on projecting Canadian economic sovereignty. Walking back within 72 hours would functionally end his political viability before his government has finished forming its cabinet. The second scenario, carrying a probability of approximately 40%, is an extended standoff lasting 60 to 90 days, in which both sides maintain their stated positions, while industries on both sides of the border begin absorbing the economic damage. This scenario carries the highest risk of cascading into permanent structural changes in bilateral supply chains, because corporate procurement decisions made under tariff uncertainty tend to become permanent even when the tariffs themselves eventually resolve. The third scenario, which I assess at approximately 25% probability, and which almost nobody in mainstream financial media is seriously modeling, is the scenario in which the EU activates its anti-coercion instrument and the dispute formally internationalizes. If that happens, the Trump administration will face a choice between backing down in a multilateral context, which the internal political logic of this administration makes essentially impossible, or escalating further, in a way that would constitute the most serious fracture in Western economic architecture since the breakdown of Bretton Woods in 1971. The final scenario, at roughly 5% probability, but with consequences so severe that any serious analyst is obligated to acknowledge it, is a cascading breakdown in USMCA, the trade agreement that replaced NAFTA and that currently governs over $1.3 trillion in annual trilateral trade, that triggers a full renegotiation process with genuinely uncertain outcomes. Drop a comment right now and tell me which scenario you think is most likely. I read every comment, and what you are seeing from your vantage point, whether you work in manufacturing, agriculture, logistics, or financial services, matters to how this story gets covered on this channel. Here is why this moment matters beyond the immediate economic disruption, and I want you to sit with this for a moment before I send you off. What is being tested right now is not just a trade relationship. It is the foundational assumption that has underpinned North American economic integration for 3 decades. The assumption that economic interdependence between the United States and Canada create a structural deterrent against the kind of coercive unilateralism that characterizes relationships between geopolitical rivals rather than treaty allies. Every supply chain decision, every cross-border investment, every manufacturing facility located in proximity to the American border, because of the logic of integrated continental production, all of it was built on that assumption. If that assumption breaks, the reconfiguration of North American industrial geography will take years, cost hundreds of billions of dollars, and the pain will not be distributed evenly. It will fall hardest on precisely the working and middle-class communities that both governments claim to represent. The retired auto worker in Windsor, Ontario, whose pension is linked to a plant that sources components from Michigan. The small lumberyard owner in Maine, whose margins depend on Canadian timber. The dairy farmer in Wisconsin who exports processed products northward. The auto parts supplier in Ohio, who has spent 2 decades optimizing a just-in-time supply chain that assumes the Canadian border is a regulatory formality rather than a tariff wall. The pharmaceutical distributor in Minnesota, whose pricing model depends on Canadian API imports that now carry a 30% premium. These are not abstractions. They are the people whose economic lives were restructured overnight by decisions made in boardrooms and Oval Offices where the immediate political calculus crowded out every serious second-order consequence. And they are precisely the people, the workers, the retirees, the small business owners, who deserve to understand not just what happened, but why it happened, who made it happen, and whether anyone in a position of power is being held accountable for the predictable damage that is now in motion. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because I will be covering every development as it breaks the first congressional reaction, the first legal challenge to the Section 232 invocation, the first major corporate announcement about supply chain restructuring, and the first indication of whether back-channel negotiations quietly opened. And you will want to be here for all of it, with the analytical framework to understand what you are actually watching. What happens next will determine whether this escalation becomes a historical footnote or the moment historians mark as the beginning of the end of the North American economic order, as we have known it. The evidence is documented, the mechanisms are already in motion, the corporate decisions are being made in real time, and the outcome has never been less certain or more consequential. Tell me in the comments which scenario you think is most likely, and tell me why is Carney's midnight move the smartest thing any Canadian leader has done in a generation, or is it the strategic miscalculation that hands Trump exactly the prolonged confrontation he wanted all along?